The Galactic Empire declared war. Humanity struck back, leaving them stunned. Ambassador Zethkar had never felt smaller despite his imposing 3-meter height. The crystalline spires of the Terran Council chamber seemed to pierce the very fabric of space around him, their surfaces reflecting the pale blue light of Earth's star in ways that made his compound eyes ache. He adjusted his ceremonial robes with one of his 4 arms while the other 3 remained perfectly still, a sign of diplomatic respect among his people, the Velthari. The humans had built this chamber in the heart of their orbital station, New Geneva, specifically for interspecies diplomacy. Unlike the grand throne rooms of the Galactic Empire, this space felt intimate yet powerful. Representatives from dozens of human nations sat in curved rows, their faces displaying emotions that Zethkar still struggled to interpret after 3 years of diplomatic service. Secretary General Maria Santos stood at the central podium, her silver hair catching the light as she reviewed the holographic document floating before her. The translation matrix hummed softly, converting her words into the 12 most common galactic languages simultaneously. Zethkar appreciated the efficiency, though he wondered if the humans truly understood what they were about to reject. Ambassador Zethkar, Maria began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustic design. The Terran Coalition has carefully reviewed the Galactic Empire's proposal for integration. We appreciate the opportunity for our species to join the galactic community. Zethkar felt a flutter of hope in his thoracic cavity. Perhaps these humans would be more reasonable than his briefings had suggested. The Empire had successfully integrated 847 species over the past millennium. Each had initially resisted, but, eventually, they all came to understand the benefits of Imperial guidance. Humans, despite their recent advancement to spacefaring status, would surely follow the same pattern. However, Maria continued, and Zethkar's hope evaporated like moisture in a solar wind. We must respectfully decline your offer of membership in the Galactic Empire. The chamber remained silent, but Zethkar could sense the tension in the air. His diplomatic training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of species preparing for conflict, and every human in the room exhibited them. Straight backs, focused gazes, hands resting casually near communication devices or ceremonial weapons. They had been expecting this moment. Zethkar activated his translation matrix and stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Secretary General Santos, perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. The Empire's offer is not merely an invitation. It is a requirement for all sentient species who have achieved faster-than-light travel. This is galactic law, established by the wisdom of the Eternal Council and enforced for the harmony of all intelligent life. A ripple of murmurs passed through the human delegation. Zethkar noted with interest that they didn't seem surprised by his words, merely confirmed in their expectations. These humans had done their research. Maria's expression never changed, maintaining the polite but firm demeanor that humans seem to excel at. Ambassador, we understand the position of the Empire. However, humanity values its independence and self-determination above all else. We've just emerged from centuries of internal conflicts to finally unite our species under a single banner of cooperation. We're not prepared to surrender that autonomy to an external authority, regardless of how well-intentioned. You speak of intentions as if they matter, Zethkar replied, allowing a note of incredulity to color his translated words. The Empire doesn't rule through intention, Secretary General. It rules through law, order, and the proven superiority of unified governance. Your species has existed in space for barely 50 of your years. The Empire has maintained peace across the galaxy for over 1,000 of your years. A human in the third row, wearing the distinctive blue uniform of the Terran Defense Force, leaned forward slightly. Admiral Chun Wei had been introduced to Zethkar earlier, though the ambassador had noted the humans' apparent discomfort with formal diplomatic protocol. Unlike Maria's diplomatic composure, the admiral's stance suggested a predator evaluating potential threats. Peace through subjugation isn't peace, Admiral Chin said, his voice cutting through the diplomatic courtesy like a plasma blade. It's oppression with better marketing. Zethkar turned his attention to the admiral, recognizing a shift in the conversation's tone. Admiral Chun, Your military background may predispose you to see conflict where none exists. The species integrated into the Empire report satisfaction rates exceeding 90%. Their populations are healthier, more prosperous, and more technologically advanced than they were before integration. And the 10% who aren't satisfied? Admiral Chen pressed. Are educated until they understand their errors in judgment. Zethkar replied automatically, then immediately regretted the honesty. Human faces around the chamber hardened, and he realized his words had been interpreted in a way that contradicted the Empire's carefully crafted image of benevolent governance. Maria stepped back to the podium, her movement drawing attention away from the Admiral's challenging stare. Ambassador Zethkar, I want to be absolutely clear about our position. Humanity appreciates the Empire's offer, but we choose to remain independent. We're prepared to establish trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense agreements with any galactic power that respects our sovereignty. However, we will not submit to imperial authority. Zethkar felt his diplomatic training warring with the growing frustration in his chest. 3 years of careful relationship building, endless cultural briefings, and patient explanation of imperial benefits, all dissolving because these humans couldn't see past their primitive attachment to independence. Secretary General, I must inform you that refusal of imperial integration is considered an act of hostility under galactic law. The Empire has legal authority to enforce compliance through whatever means necessary to maintain galactic stability. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Zethkar watched as humans throughout the chamber exchanged glances, not with fear, but with what appeared to be grim satisfaction. They had been expecting this threat as well. Are you saying the Empire will declare war on humanity if we refuse to surrender our independence? Maria asked, her voice steady but carrying clearly to every corner of the chamber. Zethkar hesitated. His instructions had been clear: offer integration, explain the benefits, apply diplomatic pressure, and, if necessary, deliver the ultimatum. But something about the humans' reactions suggested they weren't responding according to the Empire's carefully studied behavioral models. War is such an ugly word, Secretary General. The Empire prefers to think of it as forced compliance for the greater good of galactic civilization. Admiral Chen laughed, a harsh sound that made Zethkar's scales ripple with unease. You want to attack us for refusing to surrender without a fight. In human terms, Ambassador, that's called a war of conquest. We have considerable experience with those. Admiral, Maria warned. But Chen had already stood, his posture transforming from diplomatic observer to military commander. No, Madam Secretary General, I think the ambassador deserves a complete understanding of our position. Chen walked to the center of the chamber, moving with the fluid precision that humans seem to achieve when transitioning from civilian to military mindset. Ambassador Zethkar, your empire has apparently spent the last 1,000 years conquering species that couldn't effectively resist. You've grown comfortable with overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. Zethkar straightened to his full height, attempting to regain control of the diplomatic situation. Admiral, the Empire's technology is indeed superior to your own. Our fleets number in the millions of vessels. Our member species provide resources and manufacturing capability that span thousands of star systems. Perhaps you should consider these facts before. Before what? Chen interrupted. Before we make the same mistake every other species has made, let me tell you something about humans, Ambassador. We don't surrender. We don't submit. And we sure as hell don't go quietly. The Admiral activated a holographic display that materialized above the chamber's central platform. Zethkar found himself staring at a tactical analysis of human military capabilities that was far more comprehensive than anything in his briefing materials. This is what we've built in 50 years of spacefaring civilization, Chen explained, gesturing to ship schematics, defensive installations, and production facilities that stretched across dozens of star systems. We learned early that the universe isn't a friendly place. Every species we encountered tried to either conquer us, convert us, or convince us that we needed their protection. We decided to provide our own protection instead. Zethkar studied the display with growing concern. The human fleet was smaller than Imperial advance forces, but Their ship designs incorporated technologies that seemed to prioritize survivability and offensive capability over the comfort and efficiency that marked Imperial vessels. These weren't the ships of a peaceful trading civilization. They were weapons built by a species that expected conflict. Impressive for such a young civilization, Zethkar conceded. But the Empire's advantages remain overwhelming. Your largest vessels carry perhaps 1,000 crew members. Our battle cruisers house 50,000 warriors. Your weapons appear powerful, but they lack the range and precision of Imperial designs. Our defenses are designed by a species that has spent most of its existence fighting itself. Admiral Chun interrupted again. We know every possible way a military force can attack a fortified position because we've invented most of them. We know how to fight when outnumbered because we've been doing it for millennia. And we know how to make victory so costly that our enemies wish they'd never heard our name. Maria returned to the podium, her diplomatic composure intact despite the military tension that now dominated the chamber. Ambassador Zethkar, Admiral Chen's presentation is intended to inform, not threaten. We hope the Empire will reconsider its position and accept humanity as an independent ally rather than forcing us into conflict. Zethkar felt the weight of his mission pressing down on his shoulders. The Emperor's instructions had been explicit: bring the humans into the Empire or clear the way for military action. These humans seemed determined to choose conflict over submission, but surely they understood the mathematical impossibility of their position. Secretary General, I must ask you to consider the welfare of your people. The Empire's military forces have never been defeated in open warfare. Resistance will only result in unnecessary casualties and destruction. Your cities, your colonies, your very civilization will be at risk. Ambassador, Maria replied. You seem to be under the impression that we haven't considered these possibilities. Humanity has faced extinction multiple times in our history. We've survived ice ages, pandemic diseases, nuclear weapons, and our own tendency towards self-destruction. We've learned that survival often requires accepting terrible risks for the sake of principles that make existence worthwhile. Zethkar felt his diplomatic options narrowing to a single point. The humans weren't responding to logical arguments or implied threats. Their behavior suggested a species that had already committed to conflict and was now simply waiting for it to begin. Very well, he said, activating his official recording matrix. By the authority vested in me by the Eternal Council of the Galactic Empire, I hereby deliver the following ultimatum to the Terran Coalition. Submit to Imperial authority within one standard galactic month, or face the consequences of resisting lawful galactic governance. The chamber erupted in activity as human delegates activated communication devices and began coordinating responses. Zethkar noted with professional interest that their movements suggested this moment had been anticipated and prepared for extensively. Maria's voice cut through the activity, carrying the authority of a species that had chosen its path. Ambassador Zethkar, please convey the following message to your Emperor. Humanity rejects the Empire's ultimatum. We will defend our independence against any force that attempts to compromise it. We hope the Empire will reconsider its aggressive stance. But if war is the only option you'll accept, then war is what you'll receive. Admiral Chen stepped forward, his expression carrying the cold professionalism of a soldier who had moved past diplomacy into operational planning. Ambassador, I want to be certain your Emperor understands our position completely. We don't want this war. We didn't start this war. But if the Empire brings war to humanity, we'll finish it. Zethkar gathered his ceremonial robes and moved toward the chamber's exit, his forearms functioning automatically while his mind processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 3 years of diplomatic service, he had never encountered a species that seemed genuinely prepared to fight the Empire rather than submit to its authority. As he reached the exit, Maria's voice followed him one final time. Ambassador, you're welcome to remain on Earth as long as you wish. Despite our differences, you'll be treated with all diplomatic courtesy. However, I suspect you'll want to return to Imperial space to deliver our response. Zethkar paused at the threshold, turning back to address the human leadership one final time. Secretary General, Admiral Chun, members of the Terran Council. I sincerely hope your species reconsiders this path. The Empire has never been defeated because it has never encountered a species foolish enough to believe they could stand against the combined might of galactic civilization. Admiral Chen's smile was sharp enough to cut through starship armor. Ambassador, your Empire has never encountered a species like humanity. I suspect that's about to change. The door sealed behind Zethkar with a soft hiss, leaving him alone in the corridor that led to the station's diplomatic quarters. For the first time in his career, he found himself genuinely uncertain about the outcome of Imperial action. These humans had displayed confidence that seemed to go beyond mere bravado or ignorance. As he made his way to the communication suite to transmit his report, Zethkar couldn't shake the feeling that the Empire was about to learn something new about the nature of galactic warfare. The humans had seemed almost eager for the conflict to begin, as if they had been preparing for this moment since their first day in space. Perhaps that was exactly what they had been doing. The Imperial fleet would arrive in approximately 30 standard days, and Zethkar suspected that both the Empire and humanity were about to discover just how much difference 50 years could make when those years were spent by a species that refused to be conquered. Admiral Velthak had commanded Imperial fleets for over 2 centuries, and, in that time, he had overseen the integration of 43 species into the Empire. The process had become routine: arrive with overwhelming force, demonstrate Imperial superiority, accept surrender, establish Imperial governance. The longest resistance had lasted 6 days, and that was from a species that had possessed nuclear weapons and orbital defense platforms. These humans, according to intelligence reports, had neither the technology nor the numbers to mount effective resistance. Their entire fleet consisted of fewer than 8,000 vessels, most of which were converted cargo ships or mining platforms. The Imperial task force approaching the Sol system numbered 22,000 ships, including 6 planet-killer dreadnoughts, and enough firepower to sterilize every rocky body in the system. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, Velthak reviewed the tactical displays with the calm confidence of a predator approaching trapped prey. The human home system lay spread before his fleet like a 3-dimensional map of inevitable victory. Report, he commanded, his translated voice echoing across the bridge's command pit. Commander Zethrial, his tactical officer, activated the holographic display that dominated the bridge's central area. Admiral, we're detecting approximately 7,000 human vessels distributed throughout the system. They appear to be maintaining defensive positions around their major population centers and industrial facilities. Velthak studied the human deployments with professional interest. Their formations looked competent, even impressive for such a young civilization, but they were distributed across too wide an area to provide effective mutual support. Classic mistake of an inexperienced species trying to protect everything at once. What about their orbital defenses? He asked. Extensive, Admiral, but predictable. They've constructed defensive platforms around their homeworld and major colonies using directed energy weapons and kinetic interceptors. Nothing our shields can't handle, though the density of coverage is higher than our projections suggested. Velthak nodded, noting the minor discrepancy without concern. Intelligence reports were always incomplete when dealing with species that had never faced Imperial analysis. The humans had probably been building frantically since receiving the ultimatum, but quantity couldn't overcome the fundamental technological gap that separated their civilization from the Empire. Open a communication channel to the human leadership, he ordered. It's time to offer them one final opportunity to surrender before we begin compliance operations. The main display shimmered and resolved into the image of a human command center. Velthak recognized the layout from intelligence briefings. The bridge of Earth's primary orbital defense station. The humans called it Fortress Sol, though the name seemed optimistic for a structure that would be reduced to debris within the first hour of combat. Admiral Chun Wei appeared on the screen, wearing the same blue uniform Velthak remembered from the ambassador's reports. The human's expression was calm, almost serene, which struck Velthak as curious. Most species showed signs of stress when facing inevitable defeat. Admiral Chun, Velthak began, allowing his translator to convey the appropriate tone of Imperial authority. I am Admiral Velthak of the Imperial Fleet. Your month of deliberation has expired. You have failed to submit to lawful Imperial authority. I am prepared to begin compliance operations, but Imperial mercy permits me to offer one final opportunity for surrender." Admiral Chen smiled, an expression that among humans apparently indicated either pleasure or anticipation. Velthak found it difficult to tell which. "Admiral Velthak, I appreciate your consideration. However, humanity's position hasn't changed. We remain committed to our independence." "Admiral Chen, surely you recognize the mathematical reality of your situation. My fleet outnumbers yours by more than 3-1. Our technology surpasses your own by several centuries of development. Your defensive positions, while admirable for such a young species, cannot withstand the concentrated firepower of an Imperial task force." Admiral Chen's smile widened slightly. "You're absolutely right, Admiral. Your fleet is larger, your technology is more advanced, and your defensive capabilities probably exceed our own by a considerable margin." Velthak felt a moment of satisfaction. Finally, these humans were beginning to understand reason. "Then, you're prepared to surrender your forces and submit to Imperial integration?" "Not exactly," Admiral Chen replied. "You see, Admiral, you're operating under the assumption that this is going to be the kind of war you're used to fighting. Formal fleet engagements, defensive positions, traditional tactics that allow technological superiority to determine the outcome." Velthak felt the first stirring of unease. The human's tone suggested knowledge that wasn't present in Imperial intelligence reports. "Admiral Chen, regardless of your tactical preferences, the fundamental principles of warfare remain constant. Superior force applied with adequate coordination will always defeat inferior force, regardless of the determination of the defenders." "Usually true," Admiral Chen agreed. "But you're making two assumptions that might prove problematic. First, you're assuming we're going to fight the kind of war you want to fight. Second, you're assuming this is going to be a defensive action on our part." Before Velthak could respond, his sensor officer's alarm klaxons began wailing across the bridge. "Admiral, I'm detecting massive energy signatures throughout the system. The humans appear to be powering up weapons systems that weren't showing on our previous scans." Velthak spun to face his tactical display, watching as hundreds of new contact signatures appeared across the holographic representation of the Sol system. Asteroids that had appeared to be simple mining operations suddenly blazed with energy signatures indicating massive weapon systems. Space stations that had registered as civilian research facilities began displaying the electromagnetic profiles of military installations. "Stealth technology?" he demanded. "No, Admiral," his sensor officer replied, his voice tight with confusion. "These installations were always there. They were simply powered down and transmitting false identification signatures. We've been looking at a completely different system than we thought." Admiral Chen's voice drew Velthak's attention back to the communication display. "Admiral, I tried to warn you that this wasn't going to be the kind of war you're used to fighting. For the last month, you've been studying a carefully constructed fiction. What you're seeing now is what we actually built to welcome you." The tactical display updated as Imperial sensors recalibrated, and Velthak felt his confidence evaporating like atmosphere from a breached hull. The human defensive network wasn't distributed across too wide an area to provide mutual support. It was distributed to create overlapping fields of fire that could engage his fleet from multiple vectors simultaneously. The civilian installations throughout the system were armed with weapons that registered as equivalent to Imperial military hardware. The asteroid mining facilities were actually mobile weapons platforms capable of changing position while maintaining fire. The defense satellites around Earth weren't just numerous. They were numerous enough to create a virtually impenetrable barrier of directed energy and kinetic projectiles. "How?" Velthak asked, his military training demanding answers to tactical impossibilities. "Admiral, humanity has been preparing for this conversation since the day we achieved faster-than-light travel," Admiral Chen explained, his tone shifting to something like sympathy. "We knew eventually we'd encounter a galactic power that demanded submission. We decided early that submission wasn't an option we were willing to consider." Velthak's strategic analysis protocols were screaming warnings about engagement ratios and defensive advantages, but he forced himself to maintain command composure. The humans had hidden their true capabilities, but they were still facing an Imperial fleet that had never been defeated. "Admiral Chen, Deception doesn't alter the fundamental mathematical reality of your situation. You may have more defensive capability than our intelligence suggested, but you're still facing a fleet that significantly outnumbers and outguns your forces. True again, Admiral Chen agreed. Which brings me to the second assumption I mentioned. Admiral, you're about to learn something about human warfare that your intelligence reports probably didn't cover adequately. We don't just fight defensively. New alarm signals erupted across the Imperial Bridge as sensor arrays detected massive energy signatures appearing throughout surrounding star systems. Velthak's strategic display expanded automatically, showing Imperial territory that extended for dozens of light years in every direction from the Sol system. The display was lighting up with attack signatures. Impossible, Velthak whispered. Then, louder, Commander Zethriel confirmed those sensor readings. His tactical officer was bent over his control interface, his forearms moving frantically across multiple data streams. Admiral, I'm showing coordinated attacks on Imperial installations in 17 star systems. Shipyard facilities, supply depots, communication relays, and fleet staging areas are all reporting hostile contact. Admiral Chen's image remained steady on the communication display, his expression now carrying the cold satisfaction of a predator that had successfully lured its prey into a trap. Admiral Velthak, I told you this wasn't going to be a defensive action. While you've been positioning your fleet to attack our home system, we've been positioning our forces to attack yours. Velthak's command training took over, pushing shock and disbelief aside in favor of tactical analysis. Admiral Chen, you cannot possibly have enough ships to mount effective attacks on Imperial territory while defending your own system. You're right. We don't have enough ships for traditional fleet actions across that wide an area, Admiral Chen confirmed. But we're not fighting traditional fleet actions. We're fighting the kind of war humans have always excelled at. Asymmetric warfare using small units with disproportionate strategic impact. The Imperial sensor display showed the devastating effectiveness of human strategy. Rather than attempting to engage Imperial fleets directly, human forces were striking at the supply lines, communication networks, and production facilities that supported those fleets. Imperial ships might be individually superior, but they required fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, and coordination to maintain operational effectiveness. The humans were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that made Imperial fleet operations possible. This is, Velthak began, then stopped as the full scope of human planning became apparent. How long have you been positioning forces in Imperial territory? Admiral Chen's smile returned, sharp and predatory. Admiral, we've been at war with the Empire since the day your ambassador delivered his ultimatum. You just didn't know it yet. Commander Zethriel looked up from his tactical interface, his expression carrying the kind of professional alarm that indicated a situation moving beyond all established parameters. Admiral, our forces in the Kepler 442 system are reporting that they're under attack by human vessels that appear to have been hiding in the system's asteroid belt for weeks. The attack is being coordinated with local resistance groups among the recently integrated species. Velthak felt the tactical situation shifting beneath his understanding like sand in a stellar wind. Local resistance groups? Admiral Chen said, his voice carrying across the communication link with devastating clarity. You didn't just declare war on humanity. You declared war on every species in your empire that values freedom more than security. We've spent the last month making contact with resistance movements throughout Imperial space. The strategic display exploded with new contact signatures as human intelligence networks activated across dozens of star systems. Species that had been considered successfully integrated were rising in coordinated rebellion, supported by human advisors, weapons, and tactical expertise. Velthak watched his carefully planned integration operation dissolving into a multi-front war against enemies who had been preparing for months, while the Empire had been confident in its inevitable victory. You've been planning this since before our ultimatum was delivered, he realized. Admiral, we've been planning this since the day we learned about the Empire, Admiral Chen corrected. Your ambassador was very informative about Imperial integration policies. We decided early that we preferred to deal with those policies proactively rather than reactively. The communication display shifted, showing Admiral Chin's command center in greater detail. Velthak could see human officers coordinating operations across multiple star systems simultaneously, their tactical displays showing real-time updates from conflicts throughout Imperial space. Admiral Velthak, Admiral Chun continued, I want to be clear about our objectives. Humanity doesn't seek the destruction of the Empire or the conquest of Imperial territory. We want the Empire to understand that some species cannot be integrated against their will, and that attempting forced integration will be more costly than any potential benefits. Velthak studied his tactical displays with growing comprehension of the human strategy. They weren't trying to defeat Imperial fleets in direct combat. They were making Imperial control too expensive to maintain by turning every integrated species into a potential rebellion and every supply line into a target for sabotage. Admiral Chun, do you realize what you've done? Imperial policy doesn't permit rebellion among integrated species. The response to this level of resistance will be overwhelming force applied to civilian populations until resistance stops. Admiral Chun interrupted. Yes, Admiral, we understand Imperial policy quite well. We've prepared for that contingency as well. New signals appeared on the strategic display, these ones broadcasting on frequencies that Velthak recognized as interstellar emergency channels. Human vessels throughout Imperial space were transmitting detailed documentation of Imperial integration policies, including recordings of compliance actions against resistant populations. Admiral Chun explained, every species in the galaxy is now receiving real-time broadcasts of Imperial response to resistance. They're watching to see whether the Empire rules through law and order, as your ambassador claimed, or through terror and overwhelming violence, as our intelligence suggests. Velthak felt the weight of Imperial doctrine pressing against the tactical reality of the human strategy. Standard Imperial response to rebellion required immediate and devastating retaliation to prevent the spread of resistance. But applying that doctrine while being observed by every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy would transform the Empire from a symbol of stability into a demonstration of tyranny. The humans had turned Imperial strength into Imperial vulnerability by making the Empire's actions visible to species that had previously only heard Imperial promises. You cannot win this war, Velthak said, though his conviction was wavering as the scope of human preparation became apparent. Admiral Chun replied, we're not trying to win this war in the sense you understand victory. We're trying to make this war too expensive for you to continue. The tactical display updated again, showing Imperial fleet positions throughout the affected systems. Velthak realized with growing alarm that his forces were distributed across too wide an area to provide mutual support, facing enemies who could strike from any direction before disappearing into civilian populations or asteroid fields. His fleet had superiority in any single engagement, but the humans weren't offering single engagements. They were offering 1,000 small conflicts across dozens of star systems simultaneously. Admiral Chun, Velthak said slowly, what are your terms for ending hostilities? Admiral Chin's expression softened slightly, becoming less predatory and more diplomatic. Imperial recognition of human independence and a formal agreement to respect the sovereignty of any species that chooses not to join the Empire. In exchange, humanity will cease all operations against Imperial territory and encourage our new allies among the resistance movements to return to peaceful coexistence. Velthak considered the offer while watching his tactical displays fill with increasingly urgent reports from Imperial installations under attack throughout his command sector. The humans were offering him a way to end a war that was rapidly becoming unwinnable, but accepting their terms would require admitting that Imperial integration policy could be resisted successfully. Admiral Chun, I don't have the authority to negotiate such agreements. That authority rests with the Eternal Council. Admiral, I understand the limitations of your position. However, I want you to consider the alternative to negotiation. Every day this war continues, more species will join the resistance. Every act of Imperial retaliation will be broadcast to civilizations that are currently neutral. Every star system that falls into rebellion will require Imperial resources to reclaim. Admiral Chun leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. Admiral Velthak, The Empire can probably win this war if it's willing to pay the cost. But that cost will be the destruction of everything the Empire claims to represent. Imperial law and order maintained through visible brutality isn't law and order. It's naked tyranny, and tyranny creates more rebels than it eliminates. Velthak understood the calculation that Admiral Chun was offering. The Empire could pursue military victory and political catastrophe, or it could accept strategic defeat and maintain its galactic reputation. "I will transmit your terms to the Eternal Council," he said finally. Admiral Chun nodded. "Admiral, while you're communicating with your leadership, I want you to know that we respect the professionalism of your forces. This war was never about personal animosity between our species. It's about principles that neither side can compromise." The communication link terminated, leaving Velthak alone with his tactical displays and the growing realization that his centuries of military experience had not prepared him for warfare against a species that refused to fight according to established conventions. The humans had turned integration into rebellion, defensive positions into offensive operations, and imperial strength into imperial vulnerability. They had demonstrated that technological superiority meant nothing when facing an enemy that refused to engage on terms that favored that superiority. As he prepared his report to the Eternal Council, Velthak found himself wondering whether the Empire had finally encountered a species that could not be integrated because they understood something about freedom that the Empire had forgotten. The mathematical certainty of imperial victory was dissolving into the chaotic unpredictability of human warfare, and for the first time in his career, Velthak wasn't certain which side would ultimately claim success. Emperor Thaxlon the Eternal had ruled the Galactic Empire for over 600 years, and in that time, he had never received a report quite like the one transmitted from Admiral Velthak's fleet. The crystal throne room deep within the imperial capital's core echoed with the translation matrices as he reviewed the tactical assessments, casualty reports, and strategic recommendations that painted a picture of unprecedented imperial confusion. The humans had been at war with the Empire for 73 days, and in that time, they had managed to accomplish something no species had achieved in over a millennium. They had made imperial victory more costly than imperial defeat. Standing before the throne, Ambassador Zethkar maintained the respectful posture required by imperial protocol, but his forearms betrayed nervous tension that the Emperor had learned to recognize in subordinates bearing unwelcome news. The ambassador had returned from human space with detailed cultural analysis that the Eternal Council was now finding uncomfortably accurate. "Ambassador," the Emperor said, his voice amplified by the throne room's acoustic systems until it seemed to emerge from the crystalline walls themselves. "Your assessment of human psychology appears to have been more accurate than our military intelligence suggested it would be." Zethkar shifted slightly, a sign of acknowledgement among his species. "Your Eternal Majesty, the humans demonstrated behavioral patterns that our integration models did not account for. They appear to value abstract principles more highly than immediate survival, and they possess cultural experience with asymmetric warfare that predates their spacefaring civilization by thousands of years." The Emperor studied the holographic displays that surrounded his throne, showing real-time updates from star systems throughout imperial space. The human strategy had evolved beyond simple rebellion into something approaching political warfare conducted on a galactic scale. "Explain their current operations," the Emperor commanded. "Your Majesty, the humans are no longer conducting purely military operations. They have established what they term liberation networks throughout imperial space, providing technological assistance, strategic coordination, and ideological support to resistance movements among previously integrated species." The Emperor's compound eyes focused on sectors of the display showing worlds that had been peacefully integrated decades ago, now reporting civil unrest, industrial sabotage, and open rebellion. The humans had somehow convinced species that had been content under imperial rule that independence was preferable to security. "How many systems are affected?" "Your Majesty, active resistance is occurring in 147 star systems. Passive resistance, defined as reduced productivity and compliance failures, is occurring in over 400 systems. The humans have established communication networks that allow coordination between resistance cells across vast distances. The Emperor processed this information with the cold calculation that had maintained imperial stability for 6 centuries. The mathematics were becoming unavoidable. Suppressing rebellion in over 500 star systems would require military resources that the Empire possessed, but deploying those resources would leave other sectors vulnerable to human attack. What is Admiral Velthak's assessment of military options? Ambassador Zethkar activated a secondary display showing fleet dispositions and strategic analysis from the front lines. Admiral Velthak reports that the humans continue to avoid direct fleet engagement while maintaining pressure on Imperial supply lines and infrastructure. They have demonstrated technological capabilities that exceed our intelligence estimates, particularly in stealth technology and long-range strike operations. The display showed the devastating effectiveness of human tactics. Rather than defending fixed positions, human forces move continuously through Imperial